Welcome to this day event, as Jasmine said, which is all about celebrating the Russian Revolution, but actually crucially asking, what does this mean for us today? Because the Russian Revolution of 1917 was a momentous event. It was one of the pivotal events of the 20th century, and at the time it inspired millions of people across the world and actually set in motion revolutions that swept Europe in the years after it, which ultimately brought the slaughter of the First World War to an end. The truth is, revolutions don't happen all the time, but actually there have been quite a lot of revolutions over the last 100 years. Of course, the mainstream media commentators, they don't really like to talk about them too much. When they do, they dismiss them as bloody violent coups, made by a tiny minority, or where perhaps the masses of people were manipulated in some way by other forces. But actually, if you were going to go through the history of last century, you'd see revolutions pretty much every decade. Even recently, think about the Egyptian Revolution, the Arab Spring in 2011. And every single one of those, we should discuss, we should learn from, and there's lessons we can learn from them. But the truth is, the Russian Revolution stands out as being different. It is the only revolution, the only time, when ordinary people not only got rid of a despot, the Tsar, but also got power into their own hands. The only time in world history where the masses of people, the workers and peasants of Russia, took state power and set about creating a completely different world. A world where actually those who did all the work also had a say in how it was run. A world where the working class, to this day, working class is still dismissed as being stupid or selfish, can't possibly make decisions about society. Actually, those people ran society without the need for a Tsar, without the need for the landowners, without the need for bosses. It was a world where people set about abolishing class division and actually constructing a socialist society based on human liberation. I think that is something to celebrate. But not only celebrate, because we're not here to discuss the Russian Revolution in some sort of nostalgic way. We're here to learn from it. What does it mean for us today? Now look, of course, on the surface, the world looks very, very different, doesn't it, to it did 100 years ago. Britain in 2017, in many ways, bears little resemblance to Russia in 1917. Russia was actually very backwards in all senses of the world. It was a country where, although there were newly growing cities and modern industry was concentrated in them, actually it was mostly made up of peasants. Feudalism still reigned, and the Tsar ruled in a very autocratic way, as he had done for centuries. But actually, the key questions that faced Russian workers, peasants and soldiers in the years before the revolution are still with us today. And those key questions were, how can we get change? How do we confront deep inequality, brutal exploitation, vicious oppression and war? How do we confront that while a tiny minority live in grandeur and wealth and make the decisions about what happens in society? They were questions for Russian workers and peasants. They're questions for us today. Sometimes seem all the more urgent, don't they? When you've got someone like Donald Trump, a racist and sexist, who actually probably would like to rule like a Tsar in an autocratic way in the White House. But the dominant answers that were given to those questions about how do we get change, the dominant answers today are you've got to use the existing institutions of society. Above all else, go through the mechanisms of parliamentary democracy. Actually, if you think about the massive support for Jeremy Corbyn over the last year, it reflects that, doesn't it? A desire for change, but this sense that we have to go through Parliament, have to get someone else to bring those changes for us. The problem is, the history of the last 100 years is that that method fails. Even when left-wing governments have been elected, they don't have the actual power to take on the multinationals. And we know in the SWP we stand in the tradition of struggle in the here and now, but actually ultimately revolution. The Russian Revolution then gives us both a glimpse of how change can be brought about when workers act collectively and the potential for a world without exploitation and oppression. Now, I just think it's worth saying at this point, just so there is no confusion, that when we talk about the Russian Revolution of 1917, we're not talking about Stalinism. Socialism has absolutely nothing in common with the regimes of Stalin and the other Eastern European states. They were class societies. They were based on exploitation of the majority of people by a tiny elite. We would call them state capitalist. In fact, Stalinism represents a complete break from the revolution of 1917. He stood for the absolute opposite of what the revolution was about. In fact, he destroyed all of its gains. He represents the counter-revolution. We're also clear in the SWP that we're Leninists. We actually think we can learn from revolutionaries like Lenin and the Bolshevik Party that were part of making the revolution. And there is a meeting to explore this in detail later on today, but we absolutely don't think there is a straight line that runs from Lenin to Stalin. First point is Lenin actually died before Stalinism took hold, But Stalin had to murder all the old Bolshevik revolutionaries, all those that had gone through 1917, made the revolution, had fought to defend it, murdered Trotsky as well. There is literally a river of blood between Stalin and the 1917 revolution. And I say this because all the mainstream media and commentators, all the historians and academics, they link Stalin and Lenin, don't they? They link the barbarity of Stalinism and the revolutionary year of 1917. So I think we have to fight all the harder to ensure the real story of 1917 is known. But no wonder they keep it from us. Because the idea of workers running society directly without the need for bosses or a state to enforce their rule, well, it's a complete anathema, isn't it, to the rich and powerful of today. They don't want us to get any ideas that we might do it again. So they keep it from us. And that's why I think it's worth us looking at what was actually achieved in Russia in that out of revolution. Because the new society that came into being after the revolution was built on a much deeper form of democracy than we have now. It was based on Soviets, what we call workers' councils. Now, these actually first been created by workers in the revolution of 1905. It was at first a means of organising the strikes that were taking place. But they were more than just being a strike committee, far more democratic, formed in factories directly where people worked and started to assume control over most aspects of society. People where they worked or where they lived or wherever they were, meet up, discuss what needs to be done, vote, make decisions, elect delegates, coordinate with other factories and workplaces. And that was the slogan of the Bolsheviks during 1917, the slogan of the October Revolution, all power to the Soviets, really meaning all power to the workers. Now, I think this is a massive contrast to the democracy we live in now, which actually, when you think about it, in its own terms isn't very democratic. I mean, just think, Donald Trump got 3 million less votes than Hillary Clinton and was still in the White House. So even in its own terms, not that democratic. But even here in Britain, we elect MPs, who then go on to ignore most of the election pledges once they're in office. And all the people that run the multinationals, the financial institutions, they remain the same. They're unelected, they're unaccountable. They're only accountable to making profit. And what's more, you have a capitalist state run by unelected judges, unelected generals, top civil servants, running it all, protect the interests of that elite. You see, in contrast, the democracy of the Soviets got rid of an unelected minority making decisions. It actually got rid of this separation between political decisions and economic decisions. The Soviets were based on mass participation and workers running things themselves. Factories, workplaces, soldiers even, neighbourhoods had mass assemblies that would elect delegates to the Soviets. And the people they elected were delegates, not just representatives. They could be immediately recalled if they didn't act on what had been decided, if they ignored people's democratic decisions. It was a much deeper form of democracy. And immediately following the October Revolution of 1917, measures were brought in to meet the demands that had really echoed throughout that year, the demands of peace, bread and land. The very first decree of the new workers' government after October 1917 was to bring an immediate end to fighting on all fronts in the First World War. We shouldn't underestimate what a big step that was, basically saying we're coming out of the First World War, we're going to stop the slaughter. The same day, another very, very important decree, they said they were going to abolish private ownership forever. And what that meant was that all the land was taken out of the hands of all the landowners that owned the estates and given to the mass of peasants. Workplaces were put into the hands of workers. They also granted the right of self-determination to the peoples across Russia. Very long-standing element, actually, of the Bolshevik programme, that people in the former Russian Empire, a lot of them were very oppressed minorities under the Tsar, were given the right to decide whether they wanted their independence. So alongside these big changes that took Russia out of the war, gave workers and peasants control in society, alongside this was a process of much wider liberation. All of the previous norms in society were challenged. New ways of living were experimented with. I mean, for centuries, Russia had been ruled by a very reactionary, if you like, Orthodox church, which dictated a sexual morality. Now, after the revolution, the church and state were separated. And not only that, it wasn't some formal separation. I mean, they say they're separated in France and it's turned against, Muslim women in particular. It wasn't just this formal separation. It was part of a whole series of liberatory measures that were far in advance of anything that existed elsewhere in the world. Women in particular had played a key role in the revolutionary movement from the beginning. It was them actually marching on International Women's Day that had sparked the February Revolution that toppled the Tsar. But they had been completely oppressed and downtrodden in Russia. In a lot of places it was legal for husbands to whip their wives, keep the whip above the bed to enforce their domination. Immediately, women were given the right to vote. In Britain, actually, all women get the right to vote till 1928. Divorce was granted. You could have divorce just for the asking. Either spouse could ask for it, not go through some lengthy process. Again, we didn't get that till 1969 here. Children born out of wedlock given the same rights as other offspring of marriage. Crucially, abortion, available on demand. I mean, just imagine what an advance that was in Russia in 1917. I mean, this was something we didn't get till 1967 in Britain, and it's still subject to lots of limitations, and constantly the right to choose is under attack. Russia was the first country in the world to legalise homosexuality. These are not just decrees from above, they came out of people's desires to build a different society. Russian society, ordinary people's ideas had changed massively through the revolution and through going through an experience of revolution. But it's also true that the Bolsheviks knew that if women really were going to play a role in building a new society, then actually the material basis for oppression had to be broken. It's all very well having decrees, but if women were still stuck in the home doing the housework, looking after the children, it would be meaningless. And actually they had an analysis of the family. Trotsky called the family a shut-in petty enterprise, which he wanted to replace by a system of social care and accommodation, maternity houses, creches, kindergartens, schools, social dining rooms, social laundries. This is what they set about building, actually removing all of the functions that were done privately in the family in the house to be institutions of a socialist society. So these were part of a much bigger process of human liberation. Lenin talked about how revolutions are festivals of the oppressed and exploited. People that are kept down throughout most of the time and made to feel worthless, actually playing a role. And there's another meeting today which will discuss these in much more detail than I can do here. But the point is revolution unleashed people's creativity. They were building a future for themselves. There was also a flourishing of art, literature, culture, an explosion of popular debate. I mean, actually, prior to the revolution, millions of poor workers and peasants, particularly women actually, had been illiterate. They learnt to read during the revolution. There was 125,000 literacy schools set up. So there's this big explosion of debate where people are going to public squares to watch poetry, Greek drama. There's lectures and debates everywhere. Every street corner, people debating ideas. So this gives a bit of a glimpse of a different society. But how was it transformed so much in less than a year? And here I think it is worth us looking at the events of 1917 itself, which clearly was a very tumultuous year. First thing to be clear on, revolution is not a one-day event. It's often portrayed as just one day. As I said before, it's not a coup, where a tiny minority just takes power behind everyone's backs. But it's not the case that either, people just woke up one day, took some action, that was it, the changes all got made overnight. Revolution is a process. It involves millions of real people, and that in 1917, that's what you saw in Russia, it playing out, not in a linear way, but with lots of twists and turns, sometimes going forward, sometimes going backwards. Nothing was inevitable. But it was made by people fighting for control and over which forces would actually come to dominate Russia society. And people may know that in the year of 1917, two revolutions happened in Russia. There was one in February, there was one in October. Again, in the mainstream, there's often a very stark contrast drawn between them. On the one hand is that the February Revolution is good. This is the mainstream view. This gets rid of the Tsar, involves the masses. October is bad. It's a coup by the Bolsheviks and Lenin in particular. And they seize power behind the backs of the working class and the peasantry. And in this version, it's like these two revolutions are completely unrelated. February happens and then October happens, but there's nothing in between almost, really. And obviously writes out of history the role of ordinary people. But the reality is it's the events during 1917 that are crucial to explaining why the October Revolution, which is actually what put workers in power, can take place. So it's worth looking at the February Revolution. Why did it come about? Well, discontent had been brewing in Russia for some time. For decades. Russian workers and peasants had faced growing poverty, starvation, while the rich flaunted a completely decadent lifestyle. And when you think about the impact of the First World War on what was already a very poor society, it absolutely devastated it, but made clearer those class divisions and increased the suffering. Because the war affected the whole of Russian society. There was 15 million conscripts to the war from Russia. Most of them were peasants, dragged off the land to fight. And you think about Russia was a backward country. It was very ill-equipped to go to war with modern European armies. These soldiers were sent to fight without proper food, equipment, even decent boots. And there was mass slaughter. We know of the mass slaughter of the First World War. Conservative estimates say a minimum of 2 million Russians were killed in that time, thousands more wounded and captured. And of course, a very harsh discipline imposed by the generals on soldiers to make them fight and stay. But it had bigger impacts. Because most of the conscripts of the war were peasants, it actually impacted on food production. Not so much was produced. The war also monopolised all the transport links, so what food there was didn't actually always reach the towns and cities. So food shortages were very common. And really, in the days leading up to the February Revolution, thousands of people find themselves having to queue for hours in Petrograd just for a loaf of bread. Strikes were beginning. In the first few weeks of 1917, class conflict was growing. And this is what revolution grows from. It comes from this ferment. There's a crisis, if you like, of the rulers and a growing misery of the masses and class divisions getting more stark. And so it's interesting, the slogans of the revolution in February were not just economic, people were demanding bread and better wages, but they were also for an end to war and abolition of the monarchy and the Tsar. And really, the final days of the Tsar came in February 1917. And like I said earlier, the immediate spark was women textile workers going on strike on International Women's Day to demand more bread. And they sent delegates to the nearby metal factories to call out other workers. By the end of that day, 90,000 workers were on strike in Petrograd. And the next 5 days, you really saw how the workers of Petrograd spread their strikes from factory to factory, occupied the streets, defied the repressive forces of the state, which sent in the army and the police, which actually killed some of the strikers. But the numbers on the streets increased. And they appealed to the soldiers, don't fire on us. And you had groups of soldiers beginning to mutiny, defy orders, came out in support of the revolution. I mean, some of the estimates say that 70,000 troops joined nearly 400,000 people on strike. We're talking about very big numbers here. So within just 5 days, the uprising sparked the collapse of the old Tsarist regime. The last remaining troops surrendered, ministers were arrested, the Tsar abdicated. And there's a whole new revolutionary era is ushered in. Because the strikes and demos don't really stop, they continue to spread across Russia, drawing in thousands more people into this process. And it's just worth making the point, people might want to discuss it more later on during the day, that the February Revolution was not actually just started by the Bolsheviks, which were an organised revolutionary party of the time. It wasn't started by any of the revolutionaries of the time. In fact, actually, the Bolsheviks didn't put out their first leaflet calling for a general strike until 3 days into it, and already 200,000 people were on strike. They were a little bit behind the times, really. And it was during this February Revolution that the workers and soldiers recreated the Soviets, those organs of direct democracy that I talked about. They'd been seen in the Russian Revolution of 1905, and they controlled everything from the trams, the railways, factories, newspapers, and started to be formed across the country, towns, factories, and as I said, even among soldiers in the army, coming to direct the work of the revolution. So the February Revolution forces out the Tsar. What's going to happen next? Now, it's interesting to know, at this point, when it comes to delegates elected to the Soviets, actually the Bolsheviks were a minority. A very small number of delegates compared to the other parties. And the leadership of the Petrograd Soviet, which is like the main cities in Russia, after the February Revolution, was really in the hands of what were called the Mensheviks and the Socialist revolutionaries, which really based their support from the peasantry, actually, and the soldiers, who were obviously peasants in uniform, as it were. And it was this Soviet in Petrograd, in the days after the February Revolution, voted to give power to what they call the Provisional Government. And they called on the Provisional Government to now run the country. Now, this Provisional Government was actually made up overwhelmingly of what you'd call a capitalist class, a liberal bourgeoisie. They were quite happy to now wanting to build a capitalist state. Very happy for them to take political power to match their growing economic power. You can imagine all the factory owners, people that ran industry, etc. Worth noting, this class of people had actually played a very cowardly and treacherous role during the February Revolution itself. They'd actually supported the old regime of the Tsar until the last minute it became clear that the Tsar was going to collapse and then switch sides. And so now we're adopting the rhetoric of supporting the revolution, but really they wanted to limit its advances and stop the complete overhaul of society. When they're talking about building a capitalist state, there wouldn't be any room for Soviets and workers running things themselves. Thing was, the situation wasn't quite as simple as this, because the Provisional Government could not actually resolve the issues that had caused the revolution in the first place and all that explosion of activity. Because it wasn't like the thousands of people who had just brought down the Tsar just went home and accepted, well, that's the end of it. They were emboldened. They'd had a sense of their own power. They just got rid of the Tsar. They thought previously people had thought was all powerful. And they weren't about to end the fight for the things that they'd been demanding in February, crucially bread and land and peace. And the problem was the Provisional Government did the opposite. They vowed to continue the hated war. They refused to distribute land to the peasants, offered little to workers. So slaughter continued in the war, food shortages also continued. And so in response, during 1917, workers, peasants and soldiers continued to take action. Soldiers start electing their own committees to run the army units. They refused orders, which you imagine in an army doesn't usually run like that, does it? It's quite top down. And then in the summer of 1917, literally thousands of soldiers just walk away from the front back to their villages. The peasants, denied their land, start taking matters into their own hands. They start taking over the land in the countryside, burning the landlords' houses. And for workers, strikes continued as they demanded wages, better conditions. They set up factory committees to run factories essentially under workers' control. And they had things like what they called the carting out movement, where they just remove bosses and take them out in a wheelbarrow out of the factory, take control in that way. And crucially, the Soviets continued to exist and organise and make decisions. There was in effect during 1917 something we call dual power. So on the one hand, you have this provisional government, which represents the interests of the capitalists and the bourgeoisie. On the other hand, you have the Soviets, representing a revolutionary movement involving thousands and thousands of people. Both are centres of power. The provisional government had this formal power, but the Soviets remained the centre of democratic organisation and debate. So the provisional government may be issuing decrees from the top, but at the bottom you've got this growing movement of soldiers, workers, making their own decisions. And the provisional government was powerless to enforce its will. Of course, this is a very, very unstable situation. It can't last. One side is going to have to win out over the other. And this is what plays out during 1917. It's a process with lots of twists and turns, a process that also leads to people, workers, peasants, soldiers, radicalising even further. And it wasn't that the revolutionary movement just went forward automatically. There were setbacks. There was times when it looked like the old order or the capitalists might triumph, even when the Bolsheviks were put in prison or had to go into hiding during that revolutionary year. But crucially, it was also the year it saw a process of intervention by the Bolshevik Party into the situation, particularly Lenin's role. And really it was from February to October that the Bolsheviks go from being, like I said, a minority in the Soviets to being a majority. And they were able to do that because they articulated people's demands. They articulated the idea of peace, bread and land. They put forward a strategy for taking the revolution forward based on the slogan, all power to the Soviets. And they argued that the only way that the working class could achieve those demands would be by seizing political power. But this situation comes to a head in August 1917. So at this point, workers, peasants, soldiers are getting a bit frustrated with the provisional government, not resolving the issues in their favour. But on the other side, the generals, the factory owners, the landlords, they're losing patience. They want to get rid of the Soviets and his workers running things. They begin to favour a military dictatorship. And in August, there is a coup attempt by someone called General Kornilov. And he was very clear. He said he would not hesitate to hang all the Soviet members if need be. But the thing is, the coup wasn't actually just directed against the Soviets. It was also directed against the provisional government. The provisional government hesitated, didn't know what to do. Actually, it was the Bolsheviks who led the resistance to the coup and played a key role in stopping it. And that's a decisive point, when the Bolsheviks then win the majority support of workers. And at the end of August, the Bolsheviks won the majority of the delegates in the Petrograd Soviet. Trotsky was elected the chairman. At the start of September, they won the majority in the Moscow Soviet. By mid-September, they'd won the majority in the Soviets of Kiev, Baku, Finland, most of the industrial centres. Membership of the Bolshevik Party had grown from 10,000 in February to 250,000 by October. And so it's at this point, in mid-September, when they'd won the majority of workers, had the backing of big numbers of the peasantry, most soldiers turned against the war, when the parties that had supported the parliamentary democracy and the provisional government were discredited completely, and people could see that the old order was desperate to reassert itself with absolute brutality. It was this point that Lenin starts to argue for insurrection, to seize state power. And that's what takes place in the October. It's an insurrection organised by Trotsky. The slogan is all power to the Soviets. Soviet forces took control of the capital, occupying all the strategic points, disarming the few officers who were still left ready to prepared to fight for the government. So the idea it's a coup was far from it, really. Far more people actually lost their lives during February than October. Because at this point in October, the majority of workers, peasants and soldiers supported seizing state power. It was very easy. There was no one really left to defend the provisional government. And the point is, society was already being run by the Soviets, factory committees and people themselves. As Lenin said, really insurrection is the crowning act of a mass revolution. The next day, they meet. Lenin declares, we now proceed to construct the socialist order. And that's the gains we started talking about. What can we learn then, to finish up? Because like I said, the world looks very different. But we still live in a world very sharply divided by class, characterised by crisis, characterised by instability. And I think what we learned from 1917, the Russian Revolution, is that amazing potential and creativity of mass struggle. The power that workers have not only to collectively resist, but to create the basis for a vastly different, more democratic, equal society. I think we also learn that struggles break out whether they start off as being revolutionary or not, they break out unannounced and often unexpectedly, just like the February Revolution broke out without being planned by any revolutions. Every single struggle then throws up arguments, doesn't it, about strategy, about the way forward, who do you trust, what tactics do you use, what demands shall we pursue. Struggles will erupt because we live in a world of inequality, exploitation and oppression, but we have to be clear on how they end is not inevitable. And that's what we also learned crucially from 1917, that actually it was crucial to have a revolutionary party, the Bolsheviks, that had been, existed for many years before the revolution, very rooted in the working class, gone through years of experience alongside workers, learnt lessons actually. It was not the case that they just had all the answers just because they were organising their party, they learnt from workers. But crucially, at certain points during 1917 could offer a way forward, articulate those demands and argue for workers' power, organise to defend the revolution against the Kornilov coup, and then be clear that the alternative to military rule, to the old reaction, was for workers to take power. These are all lessons that we have to take as we organise today, but I think we have to start from the absolute inspiration that workers, when they act collectively, are capable of great transformation, or as John Reed, who was a journalist in Russia at the time of the revolution, said, workers are capable not only of great dreams, but they have in them the power to make dreams come true.